The lights on the Fox studio stage were blinding, designed not to flatter, but to interrogate. Tucker Carlson leaned in across the desk, his voice calm but coiled like a spring. "So tell me, Assemblyman, are you trying to turn New York into Gaza?" The room fell silent. Not the silence of respect, but of calculation. A silence made for cutting. One of the producers just off camera exhaled through his nose. You could hear the hum of a monitor. You could hear Zohran's heartbeat if you were sitting close enough. He didn't flinch. He didn't fumble. He smiled. Just once. And the room didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't a smug smile, not a grin. More like the tired, knowing half-smile of a man who's heard the same question 100 times, wrapped in 100 different insults. He leaned forward just a little, then said, "You call me extreme, because I want clean water, and a roof that doesn't collapse on working people." That was it. No raised voice, no finger-pointing, no performance. But something cracked, not in him in them. Tucker blinked. Once. Twice. Looked at his notes. Then back up, searching for footing he thought he'd never lose. And somewhere off camera, a quiet applause started. Just one person. A single pair of hands clapping slowly. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Because this wasn't just an interview. It was a setup, a televised ambush. And Zohran Mamdani, the soft-spoken Muslim lawmaker from Queens, was supposed to snap. That was the plan. The script was already written in their minds. The radical socialist loses his temper. The headline writes itself, "DSA Assemblyman Melts Down on Fox." But he didn't play the role they cast for him. He rewrote the script live in real time. And when he did, something even more dangerous happened. America started listening. Older folks who hadn't trusted people like him sat back in their chairs that night, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't know what to think, because they didn't see a threat. They didn't hear a foreigner. They saw a young man firm in faith, calm under fire, unwilling to be turned into a caricature. And maybe, just maybe, they saw a little of themselves. The ones who'd been mocked, shouted down, told they were too loud, too brown, too poor, too wrong. 'Cause that's the thing. Sometimes dignity whispers louder than outrage. And that whisper, it cracked the studio walls. 12 hours before the show aired, the trap was already lit. Inside a cold conference room at Fox headquarters, producers huddled around a table strewn with index cards. On each one a question. And next to each question, a result. Push him on Hamas. Get angry soundbite. Call him radical, watch him deflect. Imply he's anti-American, he'll fold or lash out. This wasn't journalism, it was bait fishing. They weren't hunting answers, they were hunting an outburst. Because outrage clips sell. And if they couldn't beat his ideas, they'd beat his image. You get him to shout, one exec told the producer, and we own the week. Back in Queens, Zohran Mamdani sat alone in his office, rereading an email. It wasn't from a voter. It was from a stranger in Kentucky. No name, just 5 words. Your head will roll soon. He didn't forward it to police. He didn't call his wife. He just closed the laptop. Because that wasn't new. Since being elected, they had called him every name a camera could broadcast. The Gaza guy, Mr. Jihad, Astoria's own Taliban, his crime speaking about public housing like it was sacred, saying Palestinian out loud, quoting his mother's documentary on women displaced by war. They said it made him dangerous. He never screamed back, never threatened a lawsuit, never threw a mic. He just kept showing up. And that made them furious, because they couldn't paint him as irrational when he kept answering with facts. Couldn't call him angry when he kept smiling. Couldn't reduce him to a label when he brought a grandmother from Elmhurst onto the Senate floor and said she was evicted for asking for heat. That's what made him dangerous. Not rage, but reason. Not the fight, but the refusal to play it on their terms. Still, walking into the Fox studio that day felt different, because this wasn't policy. This was theater. And he was the designated villain. The waiting room was colder than it needed to be. He sat with a folder in his lap, flipping through notes he wouldn't use. Data on Neutsche repairs, quotes from Martin Luther King, a bar chart comparing NYPD's $11 billion budget with the $0.4 billion set aside for tenant protections. It was all there. None of it would matter. A young woman from production leaned in. "They're setting lights now. Just so you know, it'll be a tight frame on your face." She didn't mean harm, but the message was clear. Every blink, every twitch, every second of delay would be captured. He nodded, folded the folder closed, and sat back. In that moment, he thought of his father, a Ugandan Indian scholar once exiled, a man who once told him, "In some rooms, silence is the most powerful argument." Then he thought of his mother, a filmmaker who'd once smuggled a camera into Gaza just to record a bedtime story. And now her son was about to sit across from Tucker Carlson. Not to tell a story, but to survive one. The hallway to the set was long and narrow. As he walked, one of the crew members whispered too quietly for anyone but him to hear. "They think you'll lose it. Don't give them what they want." He looked over. The man had a face like any other. Late 50s. Cap pulled low. Not trying to make a scene, just trying to pass along something old men say to their sons when they know the rules are rigged. Don't lose your cool, 'cause when they shout, they're strong. But when you shout, you're a threat. That was the game, and Zohran knew it. Just before air, a final mic check. Test 1, 2. He didn't speak. He stared at the stage, lit like an arena. Host seated like a judge, desk gleaming, camera already rolling. And in his mind, the line formed. Not a defense, not an attack, just a question. What makes you call someone extreme? For saying people shouldn't freeze to death in winter? He sat down, his hands folded gently in his lap. Tucker didn't offer a handshake, didn't say good evening. He looked up from his notes and fired the opening shot. You've said before that America should rethink its alliance with Israel. Do you stand by that? There it was. Loaded, prepped, ticking, but Zohran didn't blink, didn't even move. 'Cause he had already made his decision long before that room, that chair, that show. He wasn't there to survive the trap. He was there to turn the light on and show America what it really looked like. The stage lights came up like a firing squad. 4 cameras, 2 producers behind the glass, 1 countdown ticking in his ear. 5, 4, 3, no music, no warm welcome, just Tucker's voice. Tonight, a New York assemblyman who wants to raise your rent, so someone else can live for free. That was the opening line. And Zohran sat perfectly still. He didn't smile, didn't scoff, just waited. Because in this game, the first one to move always loses. Tucker turned to face him. Posture relaxed, a pen dancing between his fingers. So, Assemblyman Mamdani, he began tone syrupy. You've been described as, and I quote, a pro-Hamas sympathizer, a socialist, and someone who's called for the defunding of Israel. Pause. The words weren't a question. They were a slap. Designed not to provoke thought, but provoke anger. And that's the thing. The team at Fox wasn't hoping for a conversation. They were hoping for a clip, a 9-second meltdown, a flash of fury they could replay on loop with bold yellow subtitles. Zohran took a breath, not a deep one. Just enough to steady the air in his chest. Then, softly, "Do you call clean water extreme?" Tucker tilted his head. Didn't answer, because that's what I've asked for. For tenants who haven't had working heat in Queens since January. For grandmothers whose windows are sealed with tape because mold's growing behind the drywall. Another pause, and yet you call that Hamas. The air in the studio changed. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. Because instead of throwing a punch, he handed the audience a mirror, and some of them didn't like what they saw. Behind the glass, a producer tapped his headset twice. Why isn't he yelling? A second voice chimed in. He's not rattled, he's centered. Tucker pressed on. Well, how do you respond to those who say your proposals are unrealistic? Free housing, free health care, and a war against landlords. Zohran blinked. No reaction, no sharp inhale. Just a reply, clear, firm, and without apology. I've met a woman who pays $1,500 a month to live next to an open sewer in the Bronx. I don't think dignity is unrealistic. He turned briefly toward the camera, not for theatrics, but because he knew exactly who was watching. Her name is Layla. She's 72. Her husband was a Vietnam vet. She has 3 grandchildren, and she's never once asked for charity, only for a working stove. Silence. No one interrupted. Not even Tucker. And that was the moment the script began to break. Somewhere in Ohio, a retired trucker sat on his couch, beer in hand, watching the segment. He'd tuned in to laugh at the woke guy from New York. But now he wasn't laughing. Because something about that answer about that woman, Layla, sounded familiar. And that's how Zohran wins. Not with ideology, but with memory. He doesn't argue for socialism. He tells you about your neighbor, your cousin, your mother's pension. He doesn't raise his voice. He raises the stakes. Tucker regrouped. He leaned forward, slightly more aggressive now. Okay, let me just ask plainly. Are you ashamed to be an American? There it was. The firebomb. You could feel the temperature spike. Even the camera tightened, pulling in close on Zohran's face. He looked at Tucker. He held eye contact. Then, no. Long pause. But I'm ashamed we've let so many Americans go without a home. A doctor? A second chance. Tucker tried to interject. But Zohran spoke again, calm but louder now. I'm ashamed that we've been told our compassion is a threat, that our decency is un-American, that helping the poor is treason. The crowd behind the glass shifted. One technician let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Tucker scribbled something down. He was losing control, and he knew it, because the trap only works when you make noise. And Zohran wasn't giving them any. No rage, no sound bites, no panic. Just story after story after story. Each one more human than the last. A janitor who lost his leg and was evicted. A kid who ate crackers for dinner while living in a shelter. A nurse who worked the COVID ICU and now can't afford rent. Not statistics, not theories, not slogans. Just people. Real messy hurting people. And slowly, minute by minute, the show stopped being about him and started being about us. Tucker glanced at the monitor. They were 5 minutes behind schedule. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough. But when the producer waved a cue card, 30 seconds to spot, he ignored it. He needed to regain the frame. Are you saying, he asked, voice now clipped, that anyone who criticizes your views is racist? A trap within the trap. But Zohran didn't take the bait. He folded his hands and said, I'm saying, maybe we should stop labeling compassion as ideology. The red light on the camera blinked once. Commercial break. Silence. And on the other side of that silence, something had shifted. Not in the studio, in the country. The commercial break was supposed to cool things off, but it didn't. Tucker sat stiffly in his chair, eyes locked on the teleprompter, lips pressed thin. He wasn't angry. He was calculating, because Zohran hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made an error. And that made him dangerous. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. When the red light blinked again, signaling they were live, Tucker came in sharp. You speak often about oppression, about victims, about justice. But you grew up the son of a famous director and a scholar, in a comfortable home. What gives you the right to speak for the poor? It was a jab to the ribs. And for the first time that night, Zohran leaned back, not in retreat, but in reflection. He didn't speak for 4 full seconds. That silence, it wasn't filler. It was a choice, a break in the rhythm, a shifting of the weight in the room. And then softly, you're right. The camera didn't know where to look. I did grow up with books, with music, with conversations about justice over dinner. He turned slightly, just enough to speak not to Tucker, but to the viewer. To be honest, I didn't understand poverty. Until I saw my mother cry in silence after returning from Palestine. That wasn't on the Fox run sheet. Not even close. She came back with rolls of film, Zohran continued. She had filmed children sleeping on broken floors, women washing blood off their front steps, men who taught poetry by candlelight because the power had been cut for 3 weeks. He wasn't reading off notes. He was remembering. I asked her why she didn't speak in the film, why she didn't narrate it. His eyes didn't blink. She said, because my voice didn't belong there. Tucker opened his mouth, closed it. There was no counter to that. Because what do you say to a son quoting his mother's silence? Zohran adjusted the mic slightly on his collar. My mother is a director, yes, but she's also a woman who understood what it meant to witness suffering and not center herself in it. He shifted back toward Tucker. I learned politics from her, not from books, but from the discipline of restraint. Somewhere in Florida, a retired schoolteacher watching the show reached for the remote, not to change the channel, but to turn the volume up, because this wasn't about Israel or socialism or whatever headline Fox had prepared. This was about a boy raised by a woman who knew when not to speak, and who taught her son to do the same. And that didn't fit in a soundbite. Tucker forced a chuckle. Well, that's a touching story, but let's bring it back to New York, shall we? You've pushed policies that some call reckless. Rent freezes, luxury tax hikes limits on developer rights. That's a war on the market, isn't it? Zohran didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just asked a question. Have you ever met a woman named Francesca? Tucker didn't answer. Zohran continued. She's 86, lives in Astoria. Her building was bought by a private equity firm last year. Her rent went from $600 to $1,450 in 3 months. You know what she told me? He paused. She said I don't need much, just enough to not die in a hallway. No reply, just a long, quiet beat. Then Zohran's voice, lower, slower now. I don't think it's reckless to want Francesca to stay in her home. I think it's reckless to let numbers erase names. That was the moment. Not the biggest line, not the loudest, but the one that stuck, because somewhere between all the fire and noise, he whispered something unshakable, and the audience didn't cheer, they didn't gasp. They just listened, and that's the kind of power you can't rehearse. You have to live it. Tucker looked down at his notes. The segment was running long. The producers in his ear were whispering to wrap it. Move on, pivot. But he wasn't ready to give up the frame. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. Let me ask you something simple, he said, voice low and careful. You're a Muslim man. You've spoken at rallies where anti-Israel chants were made. You've refused to condemn specific groups when asked. Don't you think your faith, your background, makes some Americans uneasy? He delivered it like a question, but it landed like an accusation, and the room stiffened. This wasn't policy anymore. This was identity. This was the dagger, the one you hold for last, the one designed to slice through reason and go straight to the gut. For a moment, Zohran said nothing. He just breathed. In, out, measured. And then slowly he turned his chair not toward Tucker, toward the camera, toward the people who needed to hear the answer more than the man who asked the question. You asked if my faith makes Americans uneasy, he said, his voice clear but soft. I think what makes people uneasy is when someone like me speaks calmly while asking for justice. The audience didn't move. No applause, no cough, just stillness. I don't raise my voice, Zohran continued. I don't throw chairs. I don't curse at cameras. And yet, when I say everyone deserves a roof over their head, suddenly I'm labeled as extreme. He paused, then added, if I had a different last name, if I wore a cross instead of praying on a rug, would you still ask me that? No answer came. Because there wasn't one. He leaned forward now, eyes steady. My faith teaches me to stand with the oppressed. Not because it's convenient, but because it's required. A slight rise in his voice. Controlled, centered. You don't have to be Muslim to believe housing is a human right. You don't have to be brown to care about hunger. You just have to remember what your grandparents prayed for when they came here. Now Tucker flinched, just slightly, because that sentence didn't sound foreign. It sounded familiar. My grandfather worked as a night janitor in Kampala, Zohran said. He lost his home when Idi Amin declared war on Indian Ugandans. He arrived in America with nothing but a belt, a prayer bead, and the address of a cousin in Queens. He let the words hang. He built a new life. Not because someone gave him a handout, but because this country once made space for the displaced. He looked directly into the lens. I'm not asking for handouts either. I'm asking you to remember what your own people needed when they first stepped off the boat. Backstage, a producer turned to the director and muttered, this wasn't supposed to be a sermon, but it was. And that's why it worked. Because this wasn't just defense, it was revelation. A man accused of being foreign, of being radical, of being dangerous, responding with grace. And then, with fire, Zohran adjusted his sleeve, revealing a thin black string around his wrist. My mother tied this on me when I first ran for office, he said. She said it would remind me who I was when others tried to tell me otherwise. He held up his hand slightly. but I don't wear it for protection. A pause. I wear it to remember restraint. Then the twist. Because if I ever spoke with the same violence that people accuse me of, this country would bury me. Tucker blinked. Hard. The line wasn't shouted, but it thundered anyway, because everyone watching understood exactly what he meant. The rules aren't the same for everyone. Some get to yell. Others get followed home. A woman watching from her kitchen in Nebraska leaned against the counter, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't agree with all of his politics, but something about his face, his voice, his stillness reminded her of her father, a factory worker who never yelled, who never cursed, who only raised his voice once when the landlord tried to raise the rent after a flood. And suddenly Zohran didn't feel foreign anymore. He felt familiar. The camera light turned amber. Tucker signaled for break. Zohran looked at him one last time. Expression unchanged. I didn't come here to convert anyone, he said. I came here because someone had to say it out loud. Tucker came back from break fast. No intro, no soft reset. Just numbers. Let's talk facts, he said. New York City's budget. You support slashing law enforcement by billions while increasing spending on public housing by the same amount. Isn't that trading safety for ideology? It was the final swing, the one crafted to sound rational, bulletproof. Crime, budget, public safety. No one wants to be on the wrong side of those words. Zohran didn't respond right away. He reached down, took a sip of lukewarm water from a plastic cup, then set it down slowly, and asked, Do you know how many kids in the Bronx go to sleep coughing every night because of mold? Tucker raised an eyebrow. What does that have to do with police? Zohran smiled faintly. I'll explain. The NYPD receives over $11 billion a year, Zohran began calmly. That's more than we spend on schools, sanitation, libraries, and housing combined. He leaned forward, voice steady. And yet we still have trains that leak, elevators that trap seniors, tenants who haven't had hot water since Thanksgiving. He paused. A woman named Clara, 78 years old, uses a flashlight in her hallway because the bulbs haven't been replaced in 3 years. Her ceiling leaks when it rains. She called 327 times. No one came. Another pause. But when her neighbor's teenage son got into a shouting match over a stereo, the cops came in 5 minutes. He held his gaze. 5 minutes for a noise complaint. 3 years for a broken light? The crowd shifted. It was subtle but real. Someone off camera cleared their throat. Another leaned forward. Even Tucker looked down, pretending to reread his notes. Because the numbers no longer stood on their own. They had faces now. Mildewed ceilings, flashlights in hallways, grandmothers freezing through Christmas. I'm not against safety, Zohran said. I just don't think safety only comes with a badge and a baton. He looked straight into the lens again. Safety is a door that locks, a school without asbestos, a hallway without gunshots, and yes, an apartment that doesn't kill you in your sleep. Then he added, lower. If we can find billions to police poverty, we can find a few million to prevent it. The applause started small. Just one person, then another, then more. And for the first time that night, the control room didn't mute it. Tucker straightened. He'd seen this happen before. A guest flipped the frame. Take control. But this wasn't just a political win. It was something heavier. The audience wasn't cheering for a policy. They were cheering because for once someone had said it plain. Assemblyman Tucker interrupted, voice slightly tighter. Do you think private landlords are all evil? Isn't this just a war against property owners? Zohran didn't blink. No, I think some landlords are doing their best. He paused. I also think some are letting black mold rot into children's lungs. Silence. I think if you profit from people's shelter, you owe them safety. Another pause. And I think the only thing more dangerous than a slumlord is a society that pretends not to see them. Backstage, one of the younger interns whispered to her colleague, Dude, I think he's winning. But that wasn't it. He wasn't winning. He was breaking the script. No rage, no scandal, no gotcha. Just decency spoken like it wasn't radical. And in a studio built for combat that felt revolutionary. Tucker tried one last pivot. Wouldn't these reforms hurt small business owners? The middle class. Zohran turned back to him. Who do you think I represent? A beat. The middle class. The working poor. The people who get squeezed from both ends told they make too little to matter and too much to deserve help. He pointed softly without raising his hand. The single mom in Queens paying $2.100 for a one-bedroom and still taking night shifts at the hospital. He glanced at the camera again. She's not looking for pity. She's looking for a brake pedal. And then, the line. The one no one was ready for. He looked directly at Tucker and asked, "Have you ever lived in a place that smelled like mildew and shame?" Tucker didn't answer. Couldn't, because that wasn't a question. It was an exorcism. The clock ticked past its segment marker. The network wanted to move on, but the crowd wasn't done. They clapped. Longer this time. And for the first time since the broadcast began, Tucker's fingers stopped moving. His pen went still. And somewhere in the back of the room, a woman whispered, "Let him finish." The room was still buzzing from the last line. Zohran sat quietly, hands folded. Tucker tapped his pen again, more out of habit now than confidence. He was losing air, and he knew it. Still, he tried to recover. "Well," he said, forcing a half smile, "you've clearly rehearsed your talking points." A jab, small, petty. Zohran didn't respond. Just looked at him the way a teacher might look at a student who missed the point entirely. "I didn't rehearse," he said. "I remembered." From the back of the studio, a man stood up. No cue, no mic, just a quiet rise from the audience bleachers. Balding, heavy-set, late 50s, wearing a simple gray coat and faded NYPD pin. The camera didn't catch it at first, but the moment was seismic. He cleared his throat. The room hushed, and then he said it, loud enough to cut through the lights. "I was NYPD, 24 years, retired last spring." Tucker turned his head. The producers in the control booth sat forward, scrambling for camera switches. The man continued, "And he's right." It felt like the air had dropped 10 degrees. No one spoke. The man stepped forward just one row closer. "I've been in those buildings," he said. "I've seen the rot, the mold, the rats." He looked at Zohran. "You're not making it up?" "I've answered calls where old women were sleeping in coats. I've walked into kitchens where the gas had been off for weeks." He turned slightly towards the host's desk. "And we were told to clear the scene, not help." Tucker tried to speak, but the man wasn't done. "You know what breaks a cop's heart?" he asked. He pointed a finger, not angrily, just with weight. "When we're the only government service that shows up." The crowd didn't clap yet. They just listened, frozen, because this wasn't Zohran talking. This was someone they couldn't dismiss. A man with the badge, the uniform, the years. A man they had once trusted to speak for order, for law, now speaking for rot, for poverty, for the truth. "I didn't vote for you," the man told Zohran. "That landed hard. I still don't agree with half your platform." He smiled faintly. "But I know a straight line when I hear it. And then the final blow. You're not extreme. You're describing the mess we pretend isn't there." Someone clapped. Not many. Just 2 hands. Then 3 more. Then 10. Then the whole room. The kind of applause that doesn't explode but builds. Reluctant at first, then undeniable. And somewhere backstage, the showrunner muttered, "Cut to commercial." But the director said no, let it roll. Because they knew. Something real had happened. And to cut away now would be cowardice. Tucker stared at the floor. He looked like he was trying to flip to a different page in a book that no longer made sense. Because when the NYPD claps for a socialist, the script is broken. Zohran didn't bask in it. Didn't nod. Didn't raise a fist. He just lowered his head slightly, in respect, then looked at the man and said quietly, "Thank you for your service." It wasn't a line. It was a bridge between 2 very different men who both had walked into homes no one wanted to see, and neither one had forgotten the smell. The producer's voice came in over Tucker's earpiece again. "End segment, go to break, now." But Tucker didn't move. He looked at Zohran, then back at the ex-cop, and for the first time in a long career, the man who always had the last word had nothing to say. The applause finally faded. Tucker leaned back, silent. A clock above the camera ticked past the segment limit. They were nearly 10 minutes over, but no one moved. No one dared to. Zohran cleared his throat, but not to interrupt, just to breathe. "I didn't come here to win," he said. No podium, no slogan, just the words plain. I came here because someone had to speak for the people who never get invited to this table. He looked across the studio, not just at Tucker, not just at the cameras, but beyond them. To the grandmother in a rent-stabilized apartment who can't afford her arthritis meds. To the doorman who sleeps on a couch because his job doesn't cover rent. To the public school teacher whose students dodge leaks between math lessons. He paused. They don't have a lobbyist. Another pause. They have me. Tucker stayed quiet. For once, not because he was stunned, but because he couldn't find the right script to fight it. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was testimony. Zohran turned to the camera. Again. But slower this time, like he was speaking directly to a specific person. A man in Ohio, a woman in Wisconsin, someone who didn't think they'd relate to him at all. My name sounds different, he said, I know that. My skin looks different. My prayers sound different. But my values are older than my face. He held up one hand, not dramatically, just gently. My mother taught me to stand when others sat down. My faith taught me to speak softly when others shouted. And my neighbors, they taught me what survival costs. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, a little wrinkled, and he opened it carefully. This is from a boy named Tariq. He's 12, lives in my district. He unfolded it and read, Dear Mr. Mamdani, thank you for saying poor people are people. My dad works nights. I want to work too, but I'm only 12. I hope you become president. He looked up. He wrote that on notebook paper. In pencil. Then he folded it again just as gently. And I keep it in my pocket. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to, because this wasn't applause. This was something else, a hush that carried more weight than noise. The kind of silence where people don't reach for their phones. They just feel it. Tucker finally spoke, quietly. That's very moving. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't sharp. Just real. Zohran nodded, then said the line no one would forget. You call me radical, but I want the same thing your parents prayed for when they arrived here. A beat, not a mansion, not a million. Just to matter. The camera panned slightly, caught a glimpse of a woman in the third row, maybe late 60s, pearls red coat. She wiped a tear. Not dramatic, just a quiet swipe beneath one eye, like something had broken through she didn't expect. Zohran stood, not in defiance, in respect, and as he did, the entire audience did too. Not ordered, not prompted, just stood. The show didn't end with a mic drop or a walk-off. It ended with a man in a simple button-down shirt, bowing slightly toward the crowd and walking out the same way he came in, with dignity, and in homes across America, from diners in Pennsylvania to farms in Montana to apartments in Miami. People sat back in their chairs and whispered the same two words. That mattered. The show ended without music. No recap, no final panel to spin the fallout. Just a cut to black. And in the studio, silence. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because for once they didn't want to ruin it by saying anything at all. Backstage, Zohran sat alone in the green room. Same plastic cup. Still half full. Still lukewarm. He didn't drink it this time. He just stared at it. The door creaked open slightly. One of the sound engineers peeked in. Mid-30s baseball cap hoodie. The kind of guy you'd pass on the street and never notice. He didn't say much, just nodded. I've worked here 8 years, the guy said. Pause. Never seen a room like that. Then he closed the door. No handshake, no selfie. Just respect. Zohran leaned back in his chair, exhaled. It wasn't relief. It was release. The slow kind, like unclenching a fist that's been tight for too long. He pulled out his phone. No texts from campaign staff. No PR notes. Just one message from his wife. Proud of you. Don't forget to breathe. He smiled, and for the first time all day he did. On the ride back to Queens, he didn't speak. His driver, an older Haitian man named Gilbert, had the radio tuned low, Nina Simone playing. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. The city lights passed like ghosts, liquor stores, shuttered bakeries, busted neon. Same buildings he'd canvassed door to door just 4 years ago. Same stoops where mothers cried about evictions. Same corners where kids practiced speeches on cracked pavement. It was all still there. None of it had changed. Except tonight, maybe something else had. Maybe someone somewhere had heard it. When they reached his apartment, Gilbert turned down the music and asked softly, "You okay, boss?" Zohran looked at him, nodded once, then said, "I think I said what needed saying." Gilbert smiled. "That's enough." Upstairs, the apartment was dark, just a soft lamp left on over the bookshelf, and on the table a worn copy of his mother's old journal. He hadn't opened it in months, but tonight he did. The pages smelled like dust and ink and memory. There, under a note from 2004, was a quote she'd copied from Toni Morrison. "You are not the work you do. You are the person you are." He sat with that, not as a politician, as a son, as a man. He thought about the cop, the look in his eyes, the way he said, "I didn't vote for you" without venom, just clarity, and the way he followed it with something rarer than agreement, trust, that Zohran knew couldn't be won with numbers, only with presence. He placed the journal back on the shelf, went to the window, looked out at the street below. A food delivery guy zipped by on a bike. A woman pushed a stroller past a broken streetlight. Two teenagers were laughing under a bodega awning, faces lit by phone screens. Ordinary life. Nothing heroic, but somehow sacred. Because this was who he'd been speaking for. Not the donors. Not the pundits. Just them. He whispered the words without thinking. I hope it was enough. Not for votes. For the ones who are never in the room. The ones who only get called when the police come. Or when rent's past due. Or when the pipes burst. The ones who aren't radical. Or loud. Or even noticed. Just poor. And tired. And trying. His mother once told him, revolutions don't begin with shouts. They begin with someone listening when no one else would. Tonight he hadn't shouted. But maybe someone had listened. And maybe, just maybe, that's where something starts. He sat down again. The coffee was cold now, but he drank it anyway. It was 1999. Queens was loud that summer. Sirens, ice cream trucks, fathers yelling from stoops. Zohran was 8. One evening, he and his mother were walking home from the grocery store. Plastic bags in each hand, a tomato poking out the top. They turned a corner near 31st Avenue, and a man was shouting. Not at them, at the world. His rent had gone up. Again. He held a folded eviction notice in one hand and a Bible in the other. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't unstable. He was just out of rope. Neighbors didn't stop. They watched from windows. Some shook their heads. Some turned their backs. Zohran pulled on his mother's hand, wanting to walk faster. She didn't. She stopped, watched, and then calmly walked over and said, "Would you like to sit down?" That man, Clarence was his name, sat with them on the stoop for over an hour. He talked about his wife who had died the year before. He talked about the landlord's new rules. He talked about how tired he was of being angry. And not once did she interrupt him. Later that night at home, Zohran asked why she didn't say more. She smiled and said, "Because when people are drowning, they don't need your opinion. They need your ears." That line stuck. More than any civics lesson, more than any rally. It was the first time Zohran understood that politics wasn't just about policy. It was about proximity, about choosing to stay when everyone else turns away. Years later in college, he'd find that same man again, Clarence, volunteering at a housing clinic. "Still no lease," Clarence said, "but I got a purpose." He winked. "Your mom didn't fix it, but she heard me. Sometimes that's enough to start something." Zohran kept that moment close. It was what steadied his breath before every speech, what quieted his ego when the cameras rolled, and what reminded him on nights like this that power isn't who yells loudest. It's who stands still when provoked. Because the world trained certain men to explode, especially if they look like him. Brown skin, Muslim name, progressive platform. One crack of anger and the whole country sees fire, not firewood. That's why restraint is not just a tactic. It's survival, and it's also legacy. His grandfather, exiled from Uganda, once taught history in secret under candlelight. His father taught in lecture halls with no AC in Harlem. His mother filmed women walking through rubble carrying bread. And Zohran, he stands on a studio stage in a country still unsure what to make of him, and simply refuses to be reduced. The morning after the interview, he walks into his district office. No balloons, no streamers, just the usual chipped paint and a tray of lukewarm bagels. An older woman is waiting in the lobby, hair wrapped in a purple scarf, cane resting against her leg. When he steps in, she stands slowly and says, "I saw you on TV. You made me proud." Then she adds, "I didn't agree with all of it, but you didn't blink." And that to her meant everything, because we live in a world trained to make certain people blink first, to crack, to sweat, to flinch. But he didn't. Not because he was trying to be perfect, but because someone once let him watch what dignity looks like when it has every reason to scream but doesn't. Back in his office, there's a sticky note on the wall with one line. "Don't speak to impress. Speak to hold open a door." It's written in his mother's handwriting. He reads it again and goes back to work. If you watched the interview that night, you probably didn't expect much. You expected fireworks, maybe a train wreck, maybe just background noise while you washed the dishes. But somewhere between the numbers and the noise, something quieter happened. A man smiled, just once, and then said something Tucker Carlson couldn't answer. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. You don't have to agree with everything Zohran Mamdani said. You don't have to vote for him, or donate, or join his movement. But maybe you recognize the feeling he gave you, that flicker of memory, of a grandfather who worked 2 jobs and never complained, of a mother who boiled water on the stove when the heater broke, of a time when decency wasn't left or right, it was just expected. So here's what I'll ask. If that feeling is still with you, don't scroll past it. Don't mute it. Don't tell yourself it doesn't matter just because no one else is clapping. Remember it, and then do something with it. Share this story, not because it's trending, but because you know someone maybe in your church, maybe at the union hall, maybe at your own kitchen table who needs to hear it. Someone who thinks politics is just yelling. Someone who forgot what dignity looks like. Someone who might recognize it again, if you showed them. Because revolutions don't always start with shouting. Sometimes they start with a whisper, a question, a smile, or the sound of someone answering calmly when the whole room was hoping they'd crack. If you believe housing shouldn't be a lottery, if you believe restraint is a form of power, if you believe decency is worth defending even when it's quiet, then share this. Comment, not with hate, with memory. Subscribe, because stories like this don't spread by accident. They spread because people like you decide not to let them vanish. And if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever stood in a room where your name was mispronounced, your tone misread, your silence mistaken for weakness, you already know what Zohran felt that night. You already know what he carried. So maybe this isn't his story after all. Maybe it's yours. He smiled once, then said something no one could dismiss. And in that moment, America stopped arguing and started listening.